Hi students. So the subject of this video, we're going to talk about setting up our Ubuntu development environment. We're going to talk about Linux distributions, Linux packages, and Ubuntu, which we're going to be using for our Linux development environment for this course. And we'll also talk a little bit about root user accounts and the philosophy about how Ubuntu uses root user accounts. So some of the backup material, if you aren't that familiar with Linux command line to begin with, you might want to review some of the backup material that's the basis of the slides in this lecture and the upcoming lectures for this week regarding the use of Linux command line. So there's one here on Introduction to Linux Workshop. That's a good one for you to reference. There are also a couple of bash scripting tutorials here that will be useful for you when you complete the assignment if you don't have a lot of scripting experience already. Okay, so one option, as I mentioned in previous videos regarding how to complete your programming assignments. If you're running on Windows or Mac OS and you don't have a native Linux development environment, one of your options is going to be to install VirtualBox on your PC. And you can see the link here to virtualbox.org. There's also a link with a little more instructions inside the Assignment 1 document, which we'll talk about in a later video. But in terms of what the environment setup that we use for the student assistants and myself, we're going to use VirtualBox and Ubuntu. And you can see the document that I mentioned is linked to this environment setup doc that talks about how to set up your VirtualBox system. And that, like I mentioned, is also linked in the Assignment 1 document. One thing I wanted to mention, because this has come up in the past, especially as we get into Linux kernel driver development, there's a chance that you may corrupt your virtual machine by accident when you're doing Linux driver development. So when you get your initial system set up, it's a good idea to use the snapshot feature of VirtualBox to save a copy of the current state of the system. And that way, if you do something later and accidentally corrupt your root file system or your install, you have a way to get back to the original setup. So that's one handy benefit of using VirtualBox. I've got a link here to describing how to use snapshots. It's pretty intuitive, but this is something you should consider doing as a part of your system setup. So I also mentioned before, and I've got this in the class overview, that you might not have enough resources to run VirtualBox on your laptop, or you might already have dedicated Linux hardware, and this is another option for completing the assignments with the course. And you don't need a really powerful laptop in order to meet the requirements for the course. So there's lots of options on eBay or in pawn shops for something less than $200. One other option is if you don't have the ability to run Ubuntu, VirtualBox, you could also consider dual booting. So set up your system to boot into Windows, but conditionally to boot into Linux instead. And that way you can use all the resources of your laptop or your computer in your Linux boot and not have to rely on running it inside a virtual machine. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about distributions and packages. When we say distribution with Linux, what do we mean? We really mean just a collection of a bunch of pre-configured software that's maintained by a community or in some cases by companies that have created these distributions. So these are really just a collection of software packages that either companies or a community have found useful and think is a useful place for you to start when you're setting up your PC. So you could think of it as like all of the software applications that would go into, for instance, a default install of your laptop when you bought it with Windows installed. Same idea with the distribution. There's probably more packages that are associated with, for instance, editing documents or editing images, and each distribution is going to be slightly different on what they have by default, and each distribution is going to be slightly different on how you add additional packages, additional software packages. So the version and the configuration of the software that's installed on the system is going to be managed by what's called packages. Ubuntu is the distribution that we're going to be using for this course. It's a pretty popular Linux distribution, so one of the nice things about it, you can find a lot of help online and a lot of references to people that are using it. Every distribution that you use is going to have its own mechanism for adding software packages through the command line. And so Ubuntu's is called the apt package manager, which we'll talk about in a minute here. So one question you might have, especially if you come from a Windows background, is why, with Windows, I just maybe find some application that I want to use on the web and I download the executable and I run the executable installer and I install it, from whatever website I download it from. So why doesn't Linux just do it that way? Why would they use these packages that are associated with the distribution instead? And really, you can think of packages as kind of a precursor to app stores that you have today for mobile phones, and that have become popular with iPhone and Android phones. So the benefit of a package manager is that it's one centralized location that's controlled by the distribution that gives you a list of trusted software sources. So rather than trying to download from a bunch of different websites that are hosted by completely different applications, you've got one place where someone in the community is helping to maintain a list of all the packages that are configured to run and to build and run and install successfully in a distribution. So this helps solve some of the fragmentation problems. Because every distribution is a little bit different in terms of the configuration that it ships with, there might need to be slight customizations to software packages in order to make them run properly on the distributions. So by having a package manager that's built into the distribution, you can solve some of those problems because the distribution package manager will know which distribution it's getting installed into, and it can put all the required components in the correct paths and make sure that it runs correctly on the distribution. So I mentioned before, Ubuntu is one of the popular distributions. It's the one that we're going to use in this course. You can use other distributions if you want. This is just the one that we'll provide support in terms of myself and student assistants. And this is one of the things that I've pronounced wrong before I started teaching this course and had to look up pronunciations. But it's actually pronounced Ubuntu, and it's an African word which means humanity to others. The first release was back in 2004, and it's based on another distribution that's known as Debian, also a popular distribution. And the kind of the motivation behind Ubuntu over Debian is that it might be slightly less stable, but it's also going to be more up to date, have more recent software packages available than what you'd find in Debian. It's also more focused on usability than licensing. And what that means is that in Debian, there's kind of an emphasis on free software. Again, free, as I mentioned before, as in liberty, like your freedom to do whatever you want with the software, to have access to the source code. Ubuntu is less focused on making sure that, for instance, every single codec that you'd install for access to video or audio has a free and open license. And it's more focused on making sure that the system is usable as possible from installation. In other words, making it easy for users who might be just getting started out, like might be your case for this course. So the package management for Ubuntu is traditionally performed by the apt utility. That's still available and still a way that you can install packages. There's also recent support for the snap utility. And one nice thing about Ubuntu's package management system, if you try to use an application that's not currently installed, you'll get this message here that tells you how you can install that particular application. So in this case, I'm trying to use an application called Tree to look at the details of a specific folder structure, and it's giving me a helpful message saying it can't be installed, but here are some options to install it. So by simply doing sudo apt install tree, I can have the tree utility that I was trying to use installed and available in the operating system. So getting into a little bit more about how we would install applications, you can imagine that it would make sense that a default user account that you create would have access limitations. This would be important, especially if there's multiple user accounts created on a system. But it's also helpful because it prevents you from accidentally doing things you didn't want to do. So for instance, if you would happen to use rm-rf, and we'll talk a little bit more about what the rm command does, but it's basically, this command is going to be removing a directory or a set of directories. And if you happen to use rm-rf with a slash and then referencing some undefined variable, because the variable is undefined, this would look like rm-rf slash and basically just start deleting everything in your system, which is probably not what you wanted to do. And so if you're running this rm-rf slash command as a normal user account, you'd get errors back saying that you don't have the permissions to delete the contents of the root file system, which in this case would be a really good thing. But in some cases, you actually do need root access, And there are specific commands where you need to have the permissions to access things in the root file system that aren't allocated to a specific user. So for that, you would use what's called the root user account. And that account basically has access to modify or change anything on the system. So the different levels that are available to root user account or single users let the system administrator configure who should have access to specific devices on the system, who should have access to specific directories. And then again, if you can either log in as a root user or impersonate the root user, you can do whatever you want on the system. So Ubuntu, each distribution might have a slightly different philosophy on how it uses root access. Ubuntu's root access philosophy is that when you configure your default user account, you do not have root permissions for that account. However, if you are doing something that you need root permissions for, you can just use the sudo command, which is short for super user do, before whatever command you're trying to run. So if you type sudo and then the command that you're trying to run, it's going to ask you for your password. And if you enter your password successfully, it's going to run the command that you specified as if you were a root user rather than your current user account. So this is kind of a nice trade-off in that it prevents us from accidentally doing things we maybe didn't want to do when we're running things as our user account, but it also gives us the option to have root access when we need it for specific operations.